Wadawari Mon Hodungo, Nua Wasudade, the Katana Sayan Guanigura, easy getting as what the Sudarans, as what the Sudaran is the Hodoras Onions and Guides and Togadinatino Guanigura, Tony Wanaka. So welcome everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces, nice to see some new faces or names in any case. We have a great evening planned for you tonight, and without any further ado, I'll let Tayaga introduce our speaker for this evening.
All right. Now, Linda. Tego, it's going to go, Guego. It's good to be back here in our group, ready to listen and learn and share some ideas and further our thinking about the history of our community in Kahnawà. And tonight, very happy to have Dr. John Parmenter coming into our space here to share his knowledge and to focus in on one of the questions that have come up as something that people in Kahnawà really want to learn about, talk about, and get a better understanding of, which is our community's relationship to treaties, to other nations, and to the whole web of relationships that developed from the time our people moved from the Mohawk Valley up until our community established itself in Kahnawà and beyond. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. But just by way of introduction, for those of you who are not familiar with John, I've known him for many years now. Can I say, John? Ever since?
Yeah, I think you can.
The first time I saw him, I think, was in the Detroit airport when he was walking with a copy of my book, looking for me as a grad student. And he's far surpassed me since then, I should say, as a scholar, as you can tell from his background. It's not a fake background, by the way. It's a real background. That's what his office looks like. And that shows you how serious he is as a scholar and how much work he puts into it. And I have a great degree of respect for John as a person, friend, and for the work that he does. He's contributed to Akwesasne, to Kahnawà in court cases and conferences and forums, and I'm really grateful, John, for the time that you take to help us understand our past, and especially right now for the time you're taking out of your busy day to share your knowledge with us. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, Nyawe, Gerald, and Linda, for having me. Thank you very much. It's really kind of an honor to be here and to have the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and ideas on this particular issue that I've been working on for quite a while. Really, in a sense, this goes back to some of my dissertation work, but it's also been kind of put into a more recent historical context because I've been working with the Geodiage project for the past year or so, and just finished a lit review on the community, and some of the findings that I'm going to talk about today are in that review. One of the things that I took away from doing that review that I think was really important was that over the broad swath of historical writing about Kahnawà, there are moments at which people from the community either are involved directly or are involved working with other scholars. And it's at those moments that there are the most productive kinds of exchanges happening. And that's where the knowledge and the progress is actually made. When the writing of history of any Indigenous community is left solely to outsiders, that's when we have real significant issues of interpretation that, as I'm sure we all know, have real world consequences. So what I want to try to do today is talk through this particular aspect of Kahnawà's history that I've been working on. I'll try to make sure I'm done talking by about no later than 6. Okay. I'll stop here and there to see if people have questions. There's a sense a lot of material, but I'm going to share the screen now, and hopefully that'll work properly. Is that can everybody see the slideshow? Okay. The idea here is basically broken down in 3. Now where is it going to move? How do I oh, okay, so here, basically broken down in 3 ideas. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit of, oh, sorry, yeah.
Can you change the view, because
Has it got like the next one up there?
Yeah, it's got the nodes and all of the everything on
All
there.
right, let me just see where that is here. Let me get back to yeah, my Zoom skills here. Let me stop it again and I'll try again to sort of say, okay. So hopefully that will do it. Is that better?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good. So basically what I'm going to talk about are three ideas here. First, just a general kind of look at the historiography of the community down to 1760. Talk about the problems that are there, but also I think the opportunities that are presented with that. And the second part is kind of the main part of the talk. It's going to be basically a run through of the story of the Mohawks of Kahnawà and the Covenant chain. What was often assumed to be the Anglo-Haudenosaunee Covenant chain alliance actually includes the Mohawks of Kahnawà. And that's something that that's probably the main takeaway point that I would like people to kind of have today, that Mohawks of Kahnawà are intimately involved in, deeply embedded in, and part of the Covenant chain alliance that we often only hear about being connected to the Haudenosaunee and the British. And I'll finish up talking about the treaties of 1760, which are kind of the capstone of this relationship, and talk about how they really represent an unfinished project, and an important unfinished project, I think, for all of us to consider. Okay. It won't surprise anybody here when you say that how we choose to tell the histories of Indigenous communities matters. They tend to be written as narratives of loss and erasure. Recently, we've seen a trend toward writing histories of Native communities that emphasize survival and power. But however these narratives are crafted, they really shape fundamentally the ability of contemporary Indigenous nations to exercise rights and sovereignty in the present. And that's a very, very important thing to understand. In the case of the Mohawks of Kahnawà, the stakes of such representations are immense, immense for us to think about here, okay? So when you look at the way the Canadian legal system applies Western ideologies of nationhood as tests for the presence or absence of particular rights, you can begin to understand how that practice has warped historians' expectations of early Indigenous societies, has distorted how we think about what it meant to be part of an Indigenous nation, and it freezes Native people in time at the moment of first contact and measures them against external criteria of centralized political power that was allegedly operative at that time in Europe. Okay, so again, this idea of a kind of Westphalian sovereignty is held up as the standard, the bounded nation state governed by a sovereign authority with complete control over its population becomes the standard for which legitimate rights are or are not recognized. Okay, and notably, while the colonizers' political structures are permitted to evolve over time, those of Indigenous communities are not. And I think that, you know, can sort of serve as a jumping off point for talking a little bit about the historiography of Kahnawà and the critical work of community scholar Audra Simpson, whose 2014 Mohawk Interruptus really for the first time, I think, laid out the case for why Kahnawà has long been seen as an anomalous and she quoted this word, pathological place within ethno-historical scholarship on Haudenosaunee people. And where does that come from? And Simpson was sort of one of the first people to put together the connection between some of the early ethnographers of the late 19th and early 20th century who assumed that people practicing the Handsome Lake religion on Seneca and Onondaga reservations in New York State represented the last authentic Haudenosaunee practitioners of cultural traditionalism, and they rejected the idea that people living in outside major urban communities in Canada belonged within the boundaries of Haudenosaunee cultural traditionalism at all. Okay, so in a sense, they had imbibed a lot of the early language in the English sources that refers to people of Kahnawà as Mission Iroquois or praying Indians or what have you. Okay, so people in these St. Lawrence Valley communities, Kanesatake, Akwesasne included, were really outside the Haudenosaunee ethnographic canon for a long time, okay, well into the 20th century, and in some cases really almost never have these communities really been subject to or been kind of treated in what you might call the ethnographic literature. Some people would probably say that's a good thing, and maybe it is, but it has had some consequences, okay, because it's basically rendered people in these communities as, you know, suspect in the eyes of outsiders as to whether or not they actually really constitute Haudenosaunee people. And this is still going on. I mean, there's books published within the last 20 years that make these kinds of comments and statements. So that's one problem. Another problem is really actually, quite frankly, the modern US-Canada border. The geographic location of Kahnawà in Canada has really impacted its historiography in significant ways. To a great extent, scholars situated in Canada write about Native people situated in Canada and generally confine their reviews to scholars and topics in Canada. The same holds true for scholars based in the United States. Very few people conduct research on Haudenosaunee people that transcends the modern international border. It's a community here or a community there. The connections back and forth are not commonly studied, and that's a problem because that means that we're not studying the history of Kahnawà on its own geographic terms, which prior to and after 1760 entailed extensive movement across what were then intercolonial and what are eventually international boundaries. Historians who look at things largely along national lines project that border back in time into an era before it actually existed. And in doing so, they actually kind of unwittingly reinforce the authority of these two settler colonial nation states and obscure Mohawk conceptions of territoriality and identity that I would argue are really fundamental to understanding Kahnawà's place in the broader context of Haudenosaunee history. So people in Kahnawà are written off by American scholars as converts to Christianity, military allies of the French, and political exiles from the New York-based Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I'll also point out here that the French language is a major hurdle to many of my colleagues here in the United States. I was fortunate enough to grow up in Canada, so I'm a dual citizen. I was forced to learn enough French as a kid to get by. But very few scholars in the US read French sources. That's a problem for trying to understand the history of Kahnawà before 1760. Okay, so that's the case for the US. In Canadian historiography, as I'm sure all of you are familiar, the Mohawks of Kahnawà are often the bad guys in Canadian historiography, whose ancestors fought French-Canadian historical heroes like Jacques Cartier, Samuel de Champlain, and Adam Dollard des Ormeaux, and who, by their persistent advocacy for sovereign nationhood down to contemporary times, have posed a threat to the parallel aspirations of Quebecois separatists. The upshot of all of this is that all these biases, I should say, in the historiography is that the Mohawks of Kahnawà appear to neither fit nor belong anywhere. Culturally, spiritually, politically, economically, they defied efforts to constrain their engagements as Mohawks with the intrusive presence of Europeans in the St. Lawrence Valley after 1667. But one of the key factors enabling their survival as a distinct nation, their movement beginning in the late 17th century across the imaginary line separating the English colony of New York from New France, has ironically confounded their claims to indigeneity in the contemporary era. Canadian historiography, as we'll see, remains heavily committed to a narrative of the Mohawks of Kahnawà as migrants to the St. Lawrence Valley, downplaying, if not erasing entirely, the Mohawks' long-standing pre-contact use and occupancy of the region, particularly in the vicinity of Montreal Island. I'm not going to talk too much about that today. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the trends in scholarship. And I'm choosing this particular work as a recent example. I wouldn't want to, I know this looks strange because it's on the slide. I'm not trying to single out the book. The book embodies kind of many of the trends I'm talking about, but there are some things in here that I think are really important for us to understand contextually before I go into what I'm talking about here today. What Professor Logier has done in this 2018 monograph, Flesh Reborn, is fold the story of Kahnawà into an original analysis of how the St. Lawrence Valley, as he put it, became a space of renewal and regeneration for a range of indigenous peoples who were experiencing great upheavals during the 17th century. And I want to point out that the book actually has a lot of good things going for it. Logier opposes a standard narrative of indigenous withdrawal from an advancing colonial frontier, and it actually shows how these communities moved toward European settlement and carved out a place for themselves at places like Kahnawà, Odanak, Kanesatake, Lorette. His work is supported by fresh and I would say comprehensive work in French language sources. This was actually really important, and it helped Professor Logier correct several critical errors that had been, kind of repeated down to the present day in 19th century published translations. So he went back to the French originals and actually translated them, and the interpretation is different, and it's actually very important. Okay, he actually also is fully aware of the historiographical discussion that emerges from the fallout of the Oka crisis of 1990 and the subsequent litigation engaged in by these descendant communities concerning their rights. And he's got in places in the book, there's kind of a refreshing perspective where he talks about that even though these people were allies of the French were not able to dictate the terms of their participation in intercolonial wars, things like that, things where he actually sort of on occasion recognizes their sovereign standing and what have you. But despite all that, there's actually a very important statement in the book that I think is worth repeating and understanding here. And it happens on page 13 of the book. And he says, notwithstanding the realities of indigenous autonomy and accommodation on the ground, as far as the mission settlements or any other contact zones are concerned, there should be no doubt that the French colonial project was aimed at political domination. That the French generally lacked the means to impose themselves must not make us lose sight of this fact. And I want us to consider for a minute here what we are being asked to do in light of that statement. What Professor Logier has asserted with that statement is that the St. Lawrence Valley needs to be understood as fundamentally a French colonial context, even if that colonialism was aspirational in nature. And in doing so, that really removes a significant degree of agency from the indigenous people he's claiming to represent as historical actors. If these communities were, as he put it, never absorbed by the French, we're supposed to remember that it was not for the lack of effort on the part of the latter. Okay, so that's where my problems with this particular book begin. I'm not going to spend too much more time on this, but Professor Logier does kind of echo many of the long-standing tropes that are used to describe the founding of Kahnawà as migrations of people who exiled themselves from their home communities in the Mohawk Valley and who relocated to the St. Lawrence Valley permanently, converted to Christianity, aligned themselves with the French, and effectively became enemies of their former people. I don't really agree with that particular assessment. It's heavily weighted on a very troubled period, admittedly, the last 2 decades of the 17th century. There is interpersonal violence between members of the St. Lawrence Valley communities and members of Haudenosaunee nations. Okay, but I think that it's important to understand how and why such a perspective is constructed, and how and why we can perhaps do things a bit differently. Okay. Again, there's evidence in the book that Professor Loge cites that actually would kind of support an alternative interpretation. He talks about the preservation of traditional matrilineal kinship structures. He talks about seasonal subsistence patterns. He talks about the use of the Mohawk language. He talks about people moving back and forth between the St. Lawrence Valley and former settlements in Mohawk country for participation in rituals and ceremonies, to conduct trade, to find marriage partners. But ultimately, he downplays all that and essentially says it's Christianity and the French alliance that matter. And he says by 1700, we've got a divergent, different, distinct, fundamental personal identity at Kahnawà relative to everybody else in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Okay, again, as I pointed out, Logier's book is got plenty of company. The majority of mainstream non-Indigenous academic historians tend to overstate the power and influence of European colonizers over the Mohawks of Kahnawà prior to the British conquest. And these perspectives rely on, I would say, three things. The utilization of historical vantage points and analytical scales that privilege Europeans. Assumptions that equate mere contact with Europeans as colonialism. And finally, an emphasis on linear modes of inquiry that yield predetermined outcomes of inevitable European domination. In other words, we take the known outcome, people from Kahnawà end up on reserves or a reserve, and we project that back in time to find the earliest possible explanation as to why that happened. Okay, and I think there's a different way to do history, and I'm hopeful that what I suggest today can help us kind of get beyond that. I mean, it's very challenging to confront these perspectives. They're overwhelming. They've been with us for a very long time. They're not going away. Many scholars, again, not just Professor Loge, have repeated these things in recent years. And when we think about how to confront this, there's some very interesting problems that come forward here. I have a colleague at Cornell. His name's Kurt Jordan. He's a historical period archaeologist who works mainly with the Seneca Nation, but he's also done some recent work with the Gayakono people in our immediate area here in Ithaca. But he wrote a piece a few years ago that I really I think is quite important. And it's called Pruning Colonialism. Okay, and it's kind of like pruning like you would prune a shrub. For emphasis, I do the picture of a guy with a chainsaw. Okay, but I think the idea here is that we need to kind of look at the ways colonialism as a concept has really structured our inquiry into Indigenous peoples' history, and think about how this applies to people in Kahnawà, okay, and what we can do about it. Okay, so again, what Jordan is talking about here is close attention to the vantage point from which inquiry into an Indigenous community's past proceeds. What are the choices that are being made regarding the representation of values, meanings, and degrees of relevance assigned to historical evidence? Whose perspective on the community is being privileged? Within a given perspective, some historical processes or connections are going to appear more significant than others. Some are going to look invisible. This can be as straightforward as turning the tables, trying to sort of look at the history from the Indigenous community outwards. But it also can be kind of done by thinking carefully about the spatial or temporal scale at which you're writing, okay? The extent of space you're covering, the extent of time you're covering can really influence how you perceive Indigenous people's autonomy, how you assess the balance of power between different cultures, and how you understand the modes and motivations for social interaction, okay? We really, I think, have to try and avoid the kind of anticipatory arguments that rely on cherry-picked early evidence to foretell the eventual triumph of settlers. That's really, I think, a key problem in studies of many colonial era indigenous communities, not just Kahnawà. I think the final point that Professor Jordan makes that's really kind of important is we really need to avoid using the label colonialism for describing engagements that impacted indigenous peoples who were actually politically and economically autonomous. Okay, we need to sort of think about a different way to represent contexts in history that have evidence of interaction and engagement and maybe even entanglement between Europeans and Native people, but don't really constitute colonialism. When you actually stop and think about it, you know, what constitutes colonialism? It's the time in which people are subject to unchallenged military domination, where the land base has been reduced to the point by which they can sustain an independent polity, and where their own traditional cultural systems are impossible. That's really hard to find at Kahnawà before 1760. And I'm going to suggest to you in the rest of my talk that it, you know, when we talk about Kahnawà before 1760, it really matters if we find colonialism there or not. Okay, so how do we kind of go about this? So what I've chosen to kind of emphasize today is a rundown. It'll be not knock down, drag out, I promise, but the idea here is to take one kind of aspect of the community's history prior to 1760 and challenge it. Basically, one of the things when you read the history of Kahnawà that is very prominent is an assumption or an idea that the relocation of Mohawk people from the Mohawk Valley to the St. Lawrence Valley represented a rupture in their relations with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that actually weakened the ability of both entities to confront European colonialism. I think that can be challenged by an analysis of the diplomatic record of covenant chain diplomacy between the Crown, the Mohawks of Kahnawà, and the Haudenosaunee from 1700 to 1760. Are 20 distinct treaty incidents in this period of time. And it's the story, the story essentially boils down to an agreement that is centered on peace and trade relations. And those are kind of, that's the basis of what we'll be looking at here next. The belt in this particular slide is a contemporary reproduction of a covenant chain belt produced by the Six Nations of the Grand River Museum. Okay, so it's not a historic belt, but it's sort of meant to kind of show the joining of hands, the linked arms, etc., that are associated with covenant chain diplomacy. So this begins in Albany in 1700 and goes right down to the Treaty of Kahnawà in September of 1760, following the surrender of Canada. On 20 different occasions, Mohawks of Kahnawà, sometimes people from Kanesatake are present, English and often Haudenosaunee people concluded treaties with one another that contain a consistent rhetoric of peace, friendship, and commerce. So this unsettles, I would say, longstanding assumptions regarding the nature of the covenant chain as exclusively an Anglo-Haudenosaunee alliance by demonstrating its extension to the Mohawk communities of the St. Lawrence Valley. It also, I would suggest, indicates our need to rethink our understanding of the so-called illegal fur trade brokered by the Mohawks of Kahnawà between Albany and Montreal from the late 17th century, roughly 1680, down to 1760. The covenant chain treaties negotiated with the English crown by the Mohawks of Kahnawà protected their rights to acquire, transport, and exchange all manner of goods free of commercial regulation or constraints. This was a treaty-protected trade conducted at a commercial scale after 1700. And when I say commercial scale, I mean, what I mean is specialized production, defined networks for import and export, an infrastructure to support the trade, laws, standards, dispute resolution process, a medium exchange, recognition of property rights. This is commercial scale business. And this is very important, I would say, for understanding the practices of travel and trade in Mohawk daily life during the colonial period. It helps us appreciate the historical relationship between the Mohawks of Kahnawà, the Mohawk Nation, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Okay, so where Logier's book kind of ends in 1700, really kind of on a down note, if you look further into the record, you can see that the disputes between the Mohawks of Kahnawà and their kin in the Mohawk Valley really were repaired, and the friction diminished dramatically in the 18th century. So again, it's a question of perspective. Where you start the story, where you end the story, really kind of matters. So this begins in June of 1700. The Albany Commissioners of Indian Affairs, these are the local administrators of New York's crown relations with the Haudenosaunee. Most of them are ethnically Dutch, fur traders living in Albany, several of whom spoke Mohawk, and were able to kind of, had longstanding business ties to surrounding Native people. Mohawks of Kahnawà appear in Albany in June of 1700. They are identified in the records as the, quote, Canada Praying Indians. The officials in Albany promised them, as they say, goods cheap and reasonable, and the same freedom of trade, the same protection as enjoyed by other members of the Mohawk Nation residing in the Mohawk Valley. 2 years later, New York's governor, Edward Hyde, the third Earl of Clarendon, also known by his noble title of Lord Cornbury, also known by the fact that he liked to wear dresses, assured what he said, the Canada Maquas Praying Indians, that they would have, quote, the same privilege of trade with us, the English, as their brethren, the Mohawks of the Five Nations. And it's from these beginnings, 1700 and 1702, you get a regular pattern of crown diplomacy with the Mohawks of Kahnawà that persists until 1760. How do we know this stuff? Why has this been missed? Okay. One of the things that I think I can use to explain that is what my dissertation advisor used to call the law of least expenditure of effort for the historian. Most of people who've looked at the records of the Albany Commissioners of Indian Affairs have relied on a published source. Some of you may be familiar with it, Peter Raxel's Abridgment of the Indian Affairs. Okay, that was written in 1751, published in 1915 by Harvard. It's viewed as an authoritative source, but it's actually a highly expurgated, fragmentary, and substantially biased record. It is actually just about 5% of the original documents. And when you look at the original documents, which we have digitized here at Cornell, we did this a number of years ago, but that particular link in the slide will get you to the contemporary collection that has the originals. When you actually look at the originals, the story becomes clear. Okay, Raxel basically was not a fan of the Albany Commissioners of Indian Affairs diplomatic practices. He was an opponent of the fur trade they operated with the Mohawks of Kahnawà. So he tried to bury the story by selectively skipping over an awful lot of documentary evidence. Okay, but again, when you look at the originals, the story is pretty clear. I won't spend too much time on this, but I do want to make the point that there was colonial era legislation that made this trade illegal. The punishments, when they were applied, which was very rare, by both French and British colonial authorities, were applied to colonists. There's no evidence that Mohawk people or Mohawks of Kahnawà were ever fined or imprisoned or punished for their involvement in this particular enterprise. Okay, it was a treaty protected enterprise, as we'll see. Okay, I will not talk about all of these individually. For those interested, this is a listing of the dates at which Mohawks of Kahnawà are engaged in diplomacy with the Albany commissioners. It spans from June of 1700 to September of 1760. It's 20. This is a conservative list. There are several other incidents in the records that might arguably be considered treaties, but these I would say are securely treaty dates. Okay, and these are all things that have some very important elements for us to talk about. So I won't really go into details particularly about too many of them, but I do want to just talk about trends and things that are important for us to sort of bear in mind as we go through here. Okay, so this again is really kind of an untapped record of covenant chain diplomacy that upheld the right of the Mohawks of Kahnawà to pass freely across the boundary of the French and English colonies in northeastern North America in pursuit of a commercial scale carrying trade. And when you actually look at the records, you see a number of things that are quite striking and quite interesting to sort of note. Renewals of the treaty relationship occurred at regular intervals, on average once every 3 years, with exchanges of wampum belts and with one documented use of a calumet ceremony, ceremonial pipe smoking event that is quite rare among Haudenosaunee people, but there is a very interesting one that's documented in 1735. Gift exchanges occur between the Mohawks of Kahnawà and Albany officials. Those gifts are often symbolic of the goods they obtained from one another in the trade, clothing and stroud blankets and other trade goods for the Mohawks, and gifts of peltry to the Anglo-colonial officials from the Mohawks. We do see members of the Haudenosaunee participating in many, not all, but many of these diplomatic meetings. They were covenant chain treaties after all. Okay, and so they're present. One of the other parts of this these negotiations was generally the negotiation of a diplomatic neutrality agreement in which the Mohawks of Kahnawà agreed to remain neutral in declared wars between England and France that reached North America. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Very interestingly, there appears to be documentary evidence of at least one hereditary Mohawk title holder who is described as residing at Kahnawà in 1725. The Mohawk Turtle Clan chief, Dakari Hogan, is documented as resident at Kahnawà in 1725. The covenant chain diplomacy between the Mohawks of Kahnawà and the Albany authorities was actually used on several times to repair breaches in the relationship, covering of graves, for example, renewals of relations following misunderstandings about violations of the neutrality agreement. The baseline presence of the diplomatic relationship allowed people to have an audience with one another to correct things when things went badly. Okay, this persisted until the eve of the 7 Years' War. There's a very interesting incident in 1753 involving a Kahnawà Mohawk woman named Susanna. That's how she's referred to in the records. She was a porteur, a carrier employed by the Albany fur trader Robert Sanders, and Susanna helped broker the repatriation of 2 Pennsylvania traders held captive at Kahnawà in 1753. Their ransom was paid personally at Albany by a guy from Pennsylvania named Benjamin Franklin. Finally, in 1754, the Mohawks of Kahnawà renewed the covenant chain alliance once more in a formal ceremony, complete with the exchange of gifts, shared tobacco smoking wampum belts, rhetoric about the road being open to Albany for the Mohawks of Kahnawà, and the presence of hospitable fires kept burning at Albany for Mohawk visitors at all times. So this is a tremendously rich documentary record. Again, I'm just basically hitting a highlight reel here. But what my point is to set up what it does for the treaties of 1760. Okay, we won't be surprised to know that the 7 Years' War in North America, which broke out in July of 1754, disrupted formal diplomacy between the Mohawks of Kahnawà and Anglo-American authorities. But as the war came to its conclusion in 1760, with the French sort of holding out at Montreal, as the British Army closed in on them, this relationship once again became very important. Okay, the context of covenant chain diplomacy that existed prior to 1760 is really important for understanding the two formal treaties signed by St. Lawrence Valley Haudenosaunee communities in 1760s. These treaties bookended the formal capitulation of New France to Great Britain on September 8th of 1760. And I would argue they should be considered kind of a capstone to prior treaties between the Crown and Mohawks that had been negotiated since 1700. So Oswegatchie, modern day Ogdensburg area of New York, a St. Lawrence Valley Haudenosaunee community, predominantly Onondagas, but members of other nations are there too, are approached by the advancing British Army on August 30th in August of 1760. On August 30, they sign a treaty. Okay, Mohawks of Kahnawà signed another treaty just a little over 2 weeks later after that. And what these treaties represent are efforts of Crown negotiators to reconcile the Mohawks of Kahnawà by assuring them of the continuation of their existing privileges as allies. These are not treaties that represent any kind of imposition of a new or distinct form of British colonial rule, just 1 week after the French surrender of Canada. So we have to sort of understand these in kind of tandem. Oswegatchie is the preliminary that sets up the ratification at Kahnawà a couple weeks afterwards. Okay, Sir William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, is intimately involved in this diplomacy and is working very hard to ensure that this diplomatic outreach will guarantee the non-intervention of these communities in the very last stages of the campaign against New France. Okay, Oswegatchie is an interesting example. Usually Sir William Johnson kept quite scrupulous records of his diplomatic interactions with Native nations. There is no official record of this treaty. However, it has been effectively kind of reverse engineered, you might say, by people in looking at subsequent recollections of the treaty in the documentary record. The indigenous people saying, oh, at Oswegatchie in 1760, we agreed to this, and this, it's confirmed and ratified. And there's some very interesting scholarship about 20, 30 years ago where people have actually sort of gone back and said, okay, well, this is what it was. Okay, so we now know basically what went on here. Okay, essentially what was agreed upon at Oswegatchie in 1760 is kind of the groundwork of a covenant chain style agreement. What happens here is the English say, okay, we'll promise you that there'll be no reprisals for any of your past actions on behalf of the French. We'll protect all the rights and privileges you enjoyed during the French regime. We don't really know what those are, but we're going to make that statement anyway. Okay, we're going to guarantee your lands and your property, and we're going to give you, because you think it's important, freedom of Catholic religious practice. There is evidence to suggest that between the Oswegatchie Treaty and when the British Army arrived in Montreal, Johnson and his Indian Department staff stopped at Akwesasne as well to confirm the Treaty of Peace, to smoke a pipe, and to offer assurances of British protection. Again, there's no written document associated with this. We do have a recollection from the Mohawks of Akwesasne in 1764, recalling that Johnson promised them in 1760, as they said, that if the country remained in the possession of the English, we should not only enjoy the same privileges we enjoyed during the time of the French, but still more and greater, and the usage better. So these are relatively vague commitments in a sense. They're very generous on the part of the British. They're not very specific. But what the commitments at Oswegatchie enabled the British to do was essentially have a secure approach to Montreal. And Montreal formally surrenders, the French formally surrender on September 8th of 1760. Article 40 of the formal Articles of Capitulation surrendering Canada to Great Britain guaranteed that the Indigenous allies of New France, which would have included the Mohawks of Kahnawà, would be, quote, maintained in the lands they inhabit, and that they, quote, shall not be molested for having carried arms and served His Most Christian Majesty. That's Louis XV. 1 week after the surrender of Canada, the Mohawks of Kahnawà hosted Sir William Johnson for a 2-day conference that ratified the earlier Treaty of Oswegatchie. This is another interesting situation where the document that's left is very partial. Pieces of it are missing from the original. There's only bits and pieces of it left. We rely also on subsequent recollections of what was said at that to help us interpret this. But there are enough things here that are preserved in the document that are worth mentioning. One of the most important things that is mentioned in the Treaty of Kahnawà in 1760 is the Mohawks thanking Sir William Johnson for what they call renewing and strengthening the old covenant chain which before this war subsisted between us. So this is a direct callback to all that diplomacy from 1700 onward. Whether Sir William Johnson was fully aware of that, I don't know, but certainly the people at Kahnawà were, and they wanted to make sure that was in the text of the document. Okay, what they're basically doing here is not embarking on a new relationship, but essentially rekindling an old agreement. And the terms of that old agreement pertaining to trade are very much also present in the document. The speaker from Kahnawà, who's not identified, says to Sir William, "We are greatly obliged to you for opening the road from this to Albany, your country. We on our parts assure you to keep it clear of any obstacle and promise to use it in a friendly manner." So again, the language of a road, the ability to open access to Albany in a time of peace for trade is something that's quite important. Okay, Johnson was fully supportive of this. He actually invited the Mohawks of Kahnawà to accompany him back to Albany to try the, quote, goodness of the road for themselves. And again, what you have here is an explicit recognition of the right of the Mohawks of Kahnawà to free and unrestricted passage across what was then a provincial boundary between Quebec and New York, with their merchandise to conduct commerce at Albany. So for Mohawks of Kahnawà, the two treaties of 1760 represented vindication and continuation of their direct diplomacy with Crown officials conducted over the previous 6 decades. The treaties restored and renewed their time-honored position as allies of the English Crown. In an April 1761 letter to the British Army's Commander-in-Chief, General Geoffrey Amherst, Johnson reminded him once more that the road of peace and commerce should be free and open for the Mohawks of Kahnawà to travel to the British colonies. He specifically mentioned the desire of the Mohawks of Kahnawà to trade at Albany, where they can have goods, quote, much cheaper than at Montreal. He emphasized to Amherst that as long as the Mohawks of Kahnawà and other indigenous parties to the two treaties of 1760 continue to behave well and keep up to their engagements, it will be right to allow them a free open trade. Okay. And he authorized Johnson to assure the Mohawks of Kahnawà that whatever promises have been made, they shall be strictly adhered to, and so long as they behave well, they shall have a full liberty for a free and open trade. So this is the highest level of British colonial officialdom, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, who are essentially saying, yes, we signed this agreement in 1760. It matters. We're going to uphold it and support it. Okay, that message didn't immediately trickle down to some of the lower level officers. There is an incident in May of 1761 that is kind of interesting and important to mention here. There is Johnson had an agent based in Montreal named Daniel Klaus, and Klaus wrote to him very regularly about what was going on. And in May of 1761, Klaus reported that military authorities in Montreal were refusing to grant passes for the Mohawks of Kahnawà to travel to Albany on the grounds that such travel would revive the pre-war contraband trade. That's a little bit of a bizarre explanation, because at this point in time, there was no more French enemy. So the trade wouldn't really have been contraband in nature. Be that as it may, Johnson essentially said, well, we have to fix this. This isn't right. This is a treaty guaranteed right that the military authorities have no jurisdiction over. Okay, this was all settled in a treaty at Kahnawà in 1760. Okay, so he's telling Klaus that he has to remind the military authorities about that. Okay, Klaus essentially says, well, I went and talked to the people at Kahnawà and Kanesatake about it, and they said they don't really care if they get passes or not. They're just going to go anyway. Okay, they're going to go to Albany, and from there on to Mohawk settlements to visit their relations, as he puts it. And interesting, among the group is an individual who's named as a sachem of Kahnawà. I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, but Tiaugiara, who's referred to as Joseph Brant's wife's uncle at that point in time. So again, you see these kinds of connections between the Mohawks of Kahnawà and the Mohawks of the Valley and elsewhere at that point in time. So Klaus basically said, they're going to go anyway if they get a pass or not. Okay. What's interesting here is by asking for the pass, the Mohawks of Kahnawà were not undertaking a subservient gesture to British authorities to ask permission for the exercise of treaty guaranteed rights to undertake travel and trade. It actually, on their part, was a means to test the commitment of different levels of British authorities to the recognition of those treaty rights. They didn't really care if they got a pass or not. Nobody stopped them. They were going to go anyway, but they wanted to see if people would give them one. Okay, and when General Thomas Gage initially refused to give them one, they simply went about their business and ensured that the matter was brought to the attention of proper authorities and addressed later on. They continued to exercise their treaty rights afterwards. Okay, so I think it's important to understand that that kind of is what's going on here. Why does all this matter? I'm getting down to the point where I'm gonna wrap up here. But I think what's important to understand here, first and foremost, is colonized people don't sign treaties. In 1760, the balance of indigenous settler power was much more difficult for respective parties to discern than it might seem to us now. Treaties should not be understood as legal instruments that stripped indigenous nations of their rights at this point in time. Treaties with indigenous nations at this point in time originally represented a marker of sovereignty for weak, outnumbered Europeans seeking to establish a tenuous foothold in indigenous homelands by negotiating mutually agreeable terms of a relationship that made their presence tolerable to indigenous hosts. Trade was often a very significant part of those relationships. The willingness of representatives of the English crown to conduct formal conciliatory diplomacy with the Mohawks of Kahnawà makes it very difficult to sustain an argument of their colonized status. There's no indication that anyone present at Kahnawà in 1760 understood the British as some kind of new threat to their autonomy and prosperity. Instead, what the Mohawks of Kahnawà in 1760 would have understood is that the treaty relationship that had just been renewed for them following the conquest of Canada represented the culmination of 6 decades of hard work, 6 decades of hard work using regular trading expeditions between Montreal and Albany to kind of establish and maintain a communications network between their own community and their kinfolk in Confederacy towns. They did profitable business. They carried messages back and forth. They gathered intelligence on both the French and English. They negotiated agreements to avoid involvement in the wars of European colonial intruders. And even during wartime, they insisted on their right to trade and communicate with kin in enemy territory, so to speak, on New York's provincial frontier. And neither the French nor the British possessed the will or the power to deny these crucial contacts. So the record of covenant chain treaty relations between the Mohawks of Kahnawà and the English crown creates a special bond. One that I would argue is supported by a much more robust paper trail than the loan document recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1990 as securing, among other things, the treaty-protected hunting rights of the Wendats of Lorette. And I'm referring to the so-called Murray Treaty in that particular context. What we have in this context are treaties that represent the product of negotiations between two distinct legal orders that reflected the contemporary need of both parties to establish a formal relationship that would yield peaceful, ideally permanent coexistence. The language employed during these covenant chain negotiations offers clear proof that these treaties were intended as much to build specific and reliable forms of relationship as they sought to achieve practical agreements on issues of substance, primarily the trade rights of the Mohawks of Kahnawà. Crown officials used Indigenous protocols at various times, reference to fictive kin relationships, pipe smoking, ceremonial exchanges of wampum, reciprocal gift giving, shared meals. All of this demonstrated their understanding of the relational character of the treaty bond, which included an enduring pledge for each party to attend to concerns expressed by the other. So these treaties create a new normative order between the Mohawks of Kahnawà and the Crown. They're real. People at the time recognized it. It's the basis for what the British do in 1760. Without it, things could have been very different for people in the St. Lawrence Valley with the British Army advancing on the French. These treaties gave them a way out and a way forward. I think that's quite important to understand. Okay, 20 different occasions between 1700 and 1760, people come together to renew and renegotiate and update a framework for their contemporary and future coexistence. This demonstrated both parties' capacity to create and abide by norms. If we accept that these treaties were consensual arrangements for coexistence that are based on reciprocal commitments and shared understandings, we also have to recognize that each party expected the terms of the agreement to endure. Everyone would agree, I think, that any working relationship requires adjustments over time. But the core solemn promises at the heart of the agreement cannot simply be put aside by one party in a treaty relationship without the consent of the other. So what the Mohawks get from this, among other things, but for our purposes today, I'll emphasize, is explicit recognition of their unhindered right to travel and conduct trade freely across intercolonial boundaries. This relationship survived difficult episodes caused by intercolonial wars, but emerged from the 7 Years' War fully intact and sanctioned once more by Crown representatives. I have a few minutes. Obviously, I'm going to stop in just a second, but I want to just wrap up on this point because I think it is kind of important to contextualizing 1760, and then I will shut up and be happy to take questions from people, okay? I've talked a lot about what the treaties of 1760 did. I want to spend a minute and talk a little bit about what they did not do. And one thing that the treaties of 1760 did not do is correct the problematic legacy left behind by the terra nullius brand of colonialism practiced by the French prior to 1760. When I say terra nullius, what I'm referring to is the practice of the French asserting rights to territory in North America without extinguishing indigenous title. I'm not talking about the specific legal doctrine that emerged largely in the British Empire during the 19th century. What I'm basically saying here is the French did not really maintain most of the time that the St. Lawrence Valley was quote unquote empty. What they did do was appropriate indigenous lands without purchase or cession, and that led to the contemporary claim we often hear that Kahnawà and other indigenous communities are on, quote, unceded land. And legally, that's correct, okay? After 1760, the British followed an earlier precedent, the surrender of Abenaki and Mi'kmaq lands in what's now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, by the French in the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, and simply assumed that the French surrendered full title to the land, thereby rendering any requirement to extinguish remaining indigenous title unnecessary. So they did that in 1713. They do it again in the St. Lawrence Valley in 1760. And you'll notice on this map, you'll see the location of treaty boundaries. Okay, you'll notice Quebec is blank. Okay, Quebec is absolutely blank because what the British decided to do in between 1760 and 1763 was take the St. Lawrence Valley, put it into the boundaries of the province of Quebec, treat that as territory directly surrendered by the French government to the Crown, forget about dealing with indigenous rights in it, and then simultaneously exclude the St. Lawrence Valley from the defined Indian territory or Indian hunting grounds as it referred to in the proclamation of 1763. So basically everything west of the St. Lawrence Valley is handled differently by the British. The St. Lawrence Valley indigenous communities are left in a state of legal exception from the indigenous communities elsewhere in Canada whose lands were obtained by treaty purchase and surrender. That does not happen in the St. Lawrence Valley. And this anomaly was recognized as early as 1967 in a report. I came across a reference to this, and this was absolutely fascinating. In the late 60s and early 70s, the province of Quebec had a commission to study the historical integrity of the province's territory. The full title is Commission d'études sur l'intégrité du territoire du province du Québec. It's very interesting. You know, it's this massive 4-volume thing. But inside of that, there's a report. And there's pretty significant evidence that Chief Andrew DeLille from Kahnawà was involved with this. It's very interesting to sort of see. He basically has a rather defiant use of the English language in the midst of hundreds of pages of French text. But this report, which I believe DeLille was intimately involved with, it's unsigned, it's anonymous, but it actually makes a very important historical argument that talks about the indigenous communities residing within the original province of Quebec as defined in the proclamation of 1763. So the Canadian government's essentially founding legal document, the proclamation of 1763, defines the various areas that constitute the Crown's holdings. You know, there's Quebec, there's the Floridas, there's Indian hunting territory. But what DeLille is talking about is that the definition of Quebec in that document was problematic for indigenous communities in the St. Lawrence Valley who had not surrendered their rights to lands within the province and had not also been maintained in the lands they possessed at the time of surrender per the terms of the Articles of Capitulation. He complained that the St. Lawrence Valley communities had not been granted treaty rights to specific territories set aside for their use as hunting grounds, which should have happened under the terms of the proclamation of 1763. And he essentially said that both the province of Quebec and the government of Canada had failed to carry out their constitutional obligation to consider and settle the claims of Indigenous nations for these Quebec-based communities. The report concluded with the following very interesting statement. Indians residing in Quebec have an incontestable claim to an interest other than that of the province in all lands outside the original province of Quebec, and the strongest possible moral claim to rights within the original boundaries, which were taken from them without compensation and without due process of law. And that was 55 years ago. Okay. And I think, it's time that something is done about this. And that's where I'm going to stop. And I'll certainly open it up to questions there. I did want to kind of balance what I was saying about the Treaty of 1760 with that particular point, because it's a very important point. It explained for me a lot about what the contemporary problems of the community are. So thank you, everybody. I'm certainly happy to take questions. Should I get out of the share screen, Linda? Would that be good?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that.
And while you're doing that, Russ has a question.
Yeah.
Russ?
Actually, more, I guess, of a comment. I've never met Professor Parmenter, but I have worked with the Algonquin governments. I've said that, I think, before in previous sessions. And I've gotten to see their Aboriginal title research and the historical information. And I noticed, John, you didn't cover much the Royal Proclamation or the Treaty of 1764, Treaty of Niagara. You made some references afterwards, but in your PowerPoint, you didn't cover that.
No.
What I was going to say is, from the evidence I've seen around that period, the Royal Proclamation and, setting out the colony of Quebec, Rupert's Land, Indian Territory, all that stuff, that there is evidence to show that that Quebec had to, within the colony of Quebec, they still had to follow the principles of treaty making and getting consent. Like, it was still based on the doctrine of consent. There's an example with the Restigouche Micmacs, for example, where a settler wanted to take up some lands, and it was, I think this was in 1790 something. They said no, because there was no treaty with the Micmacs, and that was within the colony of Quebec. So there is evidence to show that even with the colony of Quebec, they still had to follow the principles of treaty making, under that British doctrine, right? And I noticed you made mention to what we call the Siwi case, that Murray Treaty. That's what's interesting about the Siwi case from 1990 is there was never actually a copy of that document, but the Supreme Court of Canada recognized it in the Siwi case as existing, because I think the reference was in the Sir William Johnson papers that was in the text of the court case.
Yeah.
And I think that has, good implications for Kahnawà, because like you said, there's no written text to the Treaty of Oswegatchie, but references to it.
Yeah.
And this is something that I'm glad you did this presentation, because this is something I've been raising in previous webinars, that I had questions about this period of time and how is Kahnawà structured internally to do the decision-making through the Seven Nations Confederacy into these treaties.
Yeah.
You don't address that, the internal stuff, but you address the external relations, which is a good gap to fill, because in the historical record of Kahnawà, because I think that those treaties that you're covering still have relevance today, particularly since Canada is a successor state to Britain.
Yes.
As a result of the new constitution. And I've been raising that with Taegi. Quebec's making moves, passing a Quebec language law and doing all these other things affecting First Nations in Quebec. And, I think Canada has constitutional obligations, treaty obligations to Kahnawà and others of the Seven Nations Confederacy that they're not addressing. They're letting Quebec do what they want. And, there's arguably ongoing treaty and fiduciary obligations they have as a result of these treaties and other things. But the last comment I'd make is, it's not just Kahnawà, it's the Algonquins, it's the Abenakis, pretty much all of Quebec except for the James Bay Agreement is still unceded Aboriginal title territory, because they didn't do treaties like they did in Ontario and that.
Right.
But they did kind of follow it up, as I understand it, till 1867 during Confederation. That's when Quebec really started to hand out licenses and permits all over. But they did kind of, up that point, did kind of adhere to being careful about not granting interest in land, particularly like in what's now considered Indian territory.
Yeah.
So I just thought I'd mention some of that, but I enjoyed your presentation. It was very
Well, thank
good.
you very much. Thanks for the comment. I mean, you know, I was interested actually to kind of, when I was doing this, think a little bit about where the seven nations of Canada fit into this. And it seems pretty clear to me that the seven nations of Canada is a post 1760, largely, if not completely, iteration of an alliance structure. It seems pretty clear to me that that would be.
Well, they were the French allies before that.
Well, yeah, I
But
know
then
that,
they, like you say, under the covenant chain relationship, they
yeah,
kind
I
of
think
consolidated with the British after that.
it's an interesting kind of thing to sort of see here, and I just would only add that you know, that in Quebec, the scholarship, the historians, there's an endowed chair at the what's called a Canada Research Chair at the Université de Québec à Montréal. The land question for Indigenous nations is completely displaced to the British period. There's no analysis of dispossession, land loss.
No,
in the
their
French
job is
period.
to undermine and dismiss any
Yes,
assertions of title and rights. In
yes,
fact, they view the Algonquin. They say the Algonquins abandoned their territory in
yes.
Western Quebec.
Yeah, no, there's all kinds of
and the ones that
things.
came back were Ojibways.
Yeah, yeah.
They're
I mean,
all those academics, French academics, are all developing arguments to
yeah,
basically reinforce the Quebecois assertion of
yes,
territorial integrity.
very much. No, I agree totally with that. I've seen that firsthand myself.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from, oh, sorry, Gerald, you want to go first?
No, yeah, Jerry.
Yeah.
Hi, John, thank you
Sure.
very much for that presentation. I think, as you know, I was listening to most of it while I was driving home. And so I wasn't able to watch the visuals, so I'm looking forward to the recording
Okay.
to see it. So it was a really interesting presentation. I had a different kind of a question, though.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if in any of this documentary evidence that you've been looking at, the French sources, the English sources, is there any indication of what local government looked like in Kahnawà at that point in time? I know that's been sort of an ongoing concern and an issue for this group.
Yeah.
And we don't have much documentation of what local government looked like in Kahnawà.
Yeah.
You mentioned briefly one of the sachems who was involved in signing the treaty, I believe it was. But do you have any insight into that question?
No, it's a great question, and I probably should have said more about that, because I know that's kind of what this particular group is interested in, but it's fragmentary. The Albany officials wrote names down, so there are some names that we could sort of put forward here. I was really surprised to see the reference to Takari Hogan, you know, the Turtle Clan title, who actually, there's another one later in the 18th century who is documented as living at Kahnawà. And there's a few other people there. There are numbers associated, like sometimes they'll say like there's 6 sachems of the Kahnawà praying Indians or something like that will show up here. So there's fragments there, but these are not the evidence that is largely generated in this body of documents is kind of Albany based for the most part. So they're just sort of seeing who shows up. It is a pretty rapidly changing cast of characters. Like you will see people's names pop up maybe twice sometimes, but not more than that. So it seems like, and you know, it's not clear that just because somebody in Albany wrote that this guy was a sachem that he actually was. I mean, we just don't know. So I think that's really, I mean, there's going to be some clues there perhaps that people would be able to kind of tease out of it, but there isn't really going to be a blueprint to internal Kahnawà community governance in these records. You're just sort of seeing their what you might call their external relations team or something like that, who were conducting these business trips. And they actually, you know, even the people who were identified as leaders participated in trade as well. So it was also, you know, an opportunity for them to do that. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, we have one in the chat from JP. And he's asking, what does it mean when we say we allowed the king to put his hand over the land?
I haven't really come across that one before.
Could you explain that, JP?
I think he left.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have not seen another description of that with that kind of rendering of language. That's interesting.
I haven't either.
No.
Eric has a question.
Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Parmenter. Thank you for the presentation. Perhaps you talked about this earlier. I'm sorry, I was also on and off with my children. I wanted to know, so we often talk about the War of 1812 as this moment when the relationship, those type of bilateral relationship between indigenous people and the British Crown kind of start to dissolve because they don't see them as necessary allies anymore. However, we have examples all the way to like the late 1800s where Kahnawà and Rono specifically were still used as allies, such as during the Nile. So basically my question is, from your understanding, when did that covenant chain between I mean, some people could argue that it still exists today, but as we know, those rights eventually
no, that's a good question. I mean, I've seen I would preface this by saying I'm not really an expert on the 19th century by any stretch, but I have seen some pretty clear evidence that the use of it in Indian Department records tails off dramatically after about 1830. You get to about 1830, and I think there's actually a change in it's probably after Sir John Johnson passes away. When Sir John Johnson passes away, which I believe is the late 1820s, his successors are not interested in revisiting those commitments in those terms anymore. And you see the kind of the beginnings of the effort of the Canadian settler government to undertake a program of assimilation. And obviously the covenant chain isn't going to help you with that. So you sort of see, I think, after it's about 1830 that there is kind of a pretty dramatic drop off in the use of covenant chain rhetoric, certainly by British colonial officials. We do see indigenous people, Mohawks, others, using this through the 19th and into the 20th century. But recognition of its terms, specific renewals of the agreement, with wampum, et cetera, do really diminish after about 1830.
All right. John, I had a question.
Yeah.
Just in relation to, the pipe ceremony and so forth. I mean, we have William Fenton's book from the 80s, which attempted to kind of describe all the ceremonial and ritualistic aspects of diplomacy and treaty making.
Yeah.
Has there been any, as you've encountered in your research, any new information in regard to that, sort of like related to descriptions of the different ceremonies and rituals that were used, particularly a pipe ceremony or calumet?
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing. Fenton, says up and down in the book that none of the Haudenosaunee people used the calumet ceremony. And yet in 1735, there's an extensive use of a calumet ceremony that's initiated by the people of Kahnawà. At Albany, it involves the English officials. I believe it involves Mohawks, Five Nations Mohawks as well. So, I mean, it's kind of like, oh, okay.
They used it in the Seaway in the 50s here with the official review for the Seaway.
Yeah, no, so I think it is kind of, obviously the Mohawks of Kahnawà were very well positioned to observe, participate in, watch over French diplomacy with a variety of indigenous nations from all over the place who came to Montreal. And I think they picked it up there, and, they were bringing it to kind of Albany. What's really sort of funny is in that particular conference in 1735, Raxel's marginal notes are like, this was really one of the most solemn and articulate of all the conferences that are in these records. Of course, I'm not going to tell you what actually happened, but I'm just going to write that in the description thing. So we've relied too much on this kind of really minimized version of the records, and a lot of stuff gets missed. So, I mean, that's why I think that, you know, some of the stuff that's happening with your project here, with other projects that Christian is doing, to get this documentation out there and across, we need community people's eyes on this stuff. That to me is the most important thing. That's the one thing that I really think that when I did this lit review of the community's history, the moments at which there's progress made in understanding is when people from the community are working with or doing it themselves, evidence, working with scholars, looking at evidence themselves and kind of interpreting it in a way that is important to them. And we get a whole different perspective on the past when that happens. And that's very, very important. And anything that can be done to encourage that. You know, I sort of understood that before I did this, but now it's like really clear to me. And I think the stakes of it are really high, because, you know, how your community is written about, understood, and represented in, you know, professional quote unquote scholarship can have dramatic impacts. And you know, the overall, I would say, image of Kahnawà in the literature, you know, is not really one that evokes its sovereignty. So I think people from the community, you know, my hope is that all these kinds of projects will get people, you know, interested in this kind of, you know, it seems like it's a long time ago, but the records now with the technology we have, I mean, a lot of this stuff is digitized. You can get to it, you can move it around electronically and review it. Things are different even from when I was, like, you know, in graduate school cranking on a microfilm reader, you know. So I think there's some real opportunities here, and I really hope that that more people from these communities, from Kahnawà, from Kanesatake, from Akwesasne, you know, take an interest in this period and help us in the profession to better understand what's going on. It's just really not. I mean, you know, Dave Blanchard, his stuff back in the late 70s and early 80s is a great example. I mean, he worked extensively with people in the community, and the stuff that's in his dissertation, I mean, nobody was saying this stuff until then. Like, you know, no professional scholars were saying this stuff. And it's like, you know, where is this coming from? Okay, like, he completely reorients the understanding of several significant phases of the community's past. And, you know, it was a dissertation. It never got published as a dissertation. He wrote a couple articles, but it kind of sort of fizzled. And, you know, there hasn't been that kind of, you know, collaboration or the direct, you know, activity by, you know, at least that I'm aware of people in the community to sort of look at this particular period and kind of sort of try to address what's in those documentary sources in a new way, and in a way that is in keeping with the community's priorities, right? That, you know, outside scholars, I mean, Dan Rook's book, which is very good, you know, he says it beautifully at the beginning. He says Kahnawà for a long time, you know, people have come to Kahnawà with the story written in their minds, and they confirmed it and left. Okay, and you know, he's absolutely right, and that's the thing that needs to change. But I see Jerry's hand up.
Robert had a question in the chat. I think he may have been there before I was. I do have a question and a comment, but I wanted to make give Robert a chance to.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the chat, so I'll read it, but
okay,
you can decide whether it's in your purview or not, because it's a question about international law and rectifying some problems that have come from the actions of the British and Canadian governments violating the Treaty of Kahnawà. So
yeah, I mean, I don't even, to me, you know, I'm not even 100% sure what international law would necessarily do for you in this context. I mean, it's pretty clearly, I think what ideally would happen is that these treaties would get recognized as per the Murray Treaty, and then have the force of a crown, you know, a crown treaty, and then that would be the way to kind of assess it. I mean, that could even happen, like, you know, domestically, I suppose, like within the Canadian legal context. I mean, I'm not really I don't know that it would even necessarily have to go to international law.
I mean, I can partially answer that because I was the negotiator for the Seigneurie of Saint Louis at a certain point. And when we took that to Canada and the end of that phase of the research where there was a general agreement on the facts of the case, the documentary record was a collaborative process. It was developed and it was put in between us. And there was an acknowledgement of the wrongs that were done, the frauds and abuses, as I called it in the overview report, which was acknowledged by Canada. And then later, point came around after that acknowledgement that it was still within the right of the Crown to infringe on any rights that we may or may not have. So to me, that just says from the perspective of rectifying wrongs, it's still a game of politics. So it's still a political question. We can argue within the realm of law, but anybody who studies political science at this level throughout history knows that law follows power. And then right now they have power and we're not doing anything to really address that issue. That's my response.
I can't. I can't argue with any of that.
Jerry.
John, I just wanted to say a couple of things very quickly about your comments about the covenant chain rhetoric in the 19th century. I think you're quite right that there's not much of that coming from the British, but there's a lot of it coming from Haudenosaunee people, and a lot of it coming from people in Kahnawà, actually. And a lot of the petitions, I've spoken about this a little bit before, many of the petitions that are coming from Kahnawà, Akwesasne, Grand River, Ganasakage, Tyndonega, around the issue of traditional government, where they're seeking to maintain or to reestablish traditional government where band council systems have been imposed. They're often using that covenant chain rhetoric as part of their argument to be to abolish the Indian Act system and to be officially returned to their traditional government. That's one comment. One other thing very quickly, I don't want to make work for you, but if there's somewhere you can pull together, or if those sources on the bits and pieces about the local government in Kahnawà in the 17th or 18th century, if those pieces can be pulled together, I think that would be a really interesting project for someone to work on.
Okay. I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah, lots of homework. All right, Robbie, last question, and then we're going to close. You're on mute.
Okay. Well, actually, I have two things, but they're just clarifications, really. So I'm just wondering, you spent a lot of time at the beginning of the talk, and thank you very much for the talk, by the way, very informative, but you spent a lot of time on sort of establishing the origins of the community and making it very clear that it was not, not in any way sort of separating itself from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And okay, fair enough. But if you read, I assume you've read Audra Simpson's PhD dissertation, she has there an account about the origins of Kahnawà, and she sort of says that it originates as originally a kind of temperance community of people of quite varied backgrounds, actually, not just Mohawks, other indigenous people, even some whites, coming together to create originally a community, a temperance community to get away from alcohol. And I just wonder how that fits into this picture. And then the other thing that I would like some clarification is, you seem to equivocate kind of colonialism with political domination. So in other words, you're not colonized until you're politically dominated, and to the extent that you are making treaties, you are not colonized. But I think that's a bit problematic. But then I would just ask how you feel about what some people will call commercial colonialism, which is the least intrusive kind of colonialism, right, where you show up on people's shores, for example, and you trade with them, I mean, clearly that's not domination, but it still has a very real effect on the economic relations within that territory, even if you never get out of your boat, for example. And then and there's a question there of whether you want to look at that as a separate form of colonialism. Maybe you don't want to look at it as colonialism at all, but perhaps you could clarify the picture there, because I think most people would see it as a stage in the eventual colonialism. So if we could just get some clarification.
Yeah, okay, no, those are good questions. I'll try to go quickly here. There are a lot of reasons why people go to Kahnawà in the late 17th century. Temperance is one of them. I would not myself put that at the top of the list, but it is on the list. There were some people who were converts to Christianity who went to Kahnawà after 1667. There were a lot more people who really weren't, and who went there for other reasons. I think that, you know, anytime, you know, one of the things that, you know, we try to sort of appreciate when we do this work is to sort of say, well, you know, is there a single monocausal explanation for this? And in a way there really isn't, but that's, be that as it may. The other question, I think the thing that's interesting here is when you said, you know, what you described with commercial colonialism, I would sort of call entanglement. Okay, you're basically engaged with an outside entity. It is affecting you, but it is not directing you. Okay, that there's a difference. And when you say eventual, you're assuming the outcome. And that's the thing that I think we really have to watch, is that, you know, you can't assume that people in 1760 and 1720 understood that by the late 19th century, their community was going to be a reserve, a bounded fixed reserve, where they were going to be subject to the control of an Indian agent. Okay, people can't predict the future, and we have to kind of gauge and understand their actions by what the limits of the possible were while they were alive, while they were making decisions, while they were doing the best they could with the information they had available to them. Okay, that's not to say that we deny that colonialism ever happened. But what we do want to be careful of is saying that people were engaged in a process that somehow eventually was going to end up the way it is now. Okay, and that sort of inevitability is the problem in my view. So yeah, I do push back pretty hard against what constitutes colonial status. I think personally it should be a very high bar for people. Okay, because, you know, if you're truly colonized, you're completely dependent. Politically, you're completely dependent. Economically, you're subordinated. You know, maybe you're enslaved. These kinds of things. It's a pretty stark state. I don't think that even the French authorities, right down to 1760, you know, in their candid moments, really thought that they had any kind of control over that community at all. It's quite clear they didn't. So what was it then? I think it's something else. I think we have to kind of think about how to get at that, how to represent it and describe it. Again, entanglement isn't necessarily a perfect way, but I would push back against the idea that colonialism was an apt descriptor for this community prior to 1760. That's all. But thank you for the question. That's a good question.
But if I might follow up, I just would ask, like, you're looking at it from the point of view of the indigenous people and removing kind of blameworthiness. Fair enough, entanglement. But do you not feel that the intent from the other side, from the French or the British, was not necessarily this inevitability, as you put it, like that they did not aspire to ultimately take control of it down the road, or that even the colonizers at that point don't really have a plan for what's going to happen?
Well, I would certainly agree with that. I think there's several other scholars who would say no. I mean, that, you know, that domination is baked in the cake. That's what Europeans were spending their time here to achieve. And that's how we have to understand this, right? I mean, that colors the entire context of the interaction. You know, I would argue that, I mean, sure, they might have wanted it, but could they actually get it? I mean, I want a lot of things, but I don't get them. You know, so how does that work? But yeah, again, good questions, and it's a good back and forth. And I just think people have to resist the easy kind of, well, yeah, we know that Native people ended up on reserves, so who really cares how or why that happened? Let's just, you know, whatever. And you see a lot of that, and that's a problem.
We did have one more question from Leslie. I don't know if you want to say your question, Leslie, or leave it in the chat.
Actually,
There is something.
yeah, hi, thanks, Gerald. It's really about historical record, because we're in history making right now, and I work similarly alongside First Nations asserting their sovereignty, and we find ourselves in these meetings weekly and monthly, and historical record is going to be really important. So we're not in the position we are now 100 years from now. So as a historian, maybe what advice would you give then in terms of the power relations on who's documenting what is happening today around this issue?
That's very important. I mean, being able to keep contemporary versions of events in various media would be certainly something I would advise, you know, because the power to tell the story, power to sort of gatekeep the records, the ability to name is very important in all this. So Indigenous communities have tremendous capacities now that in the 18th century didn't exist. So I would hope that people would be taking advantage of those things to kind of keep a record, their record of events that you know someday may be needed, compared to, you know, some kind of legalese gobbledygook Supreme Court decision that people with PhDs can't understand. That, you know, that's the issue, right? I mean, you know, you read these kinds of things, it's like, what is this? I mean, what's even going on here? So yeah, I think it's important that these kind of projects, the Diodiage project, the Onwe project, that they actually constitute, you know, an archive, a body of material, but also Indigenous people's understandings of it, right? Because I mean, we've only had, for the most part, white guys like me looking at this. And you know, there needs to be different eyes on it, people coming from a different cultural context to kind of understand these things in a holistic way, in a way that does justice to the context in which they were created.
Thank you for that.
Well,
Any closing words, Gerald?
yeah, I just wanted to say, go to our friend John here for excellent presentation. Go to everybody for the questions, and
Yes,
leaving us with some really good things to think about as we go forward. And before we do the closing, I just wanted to mention we have 2 more webinars at least set up. So March 9th, we have Paul Rice from Kahnawà, who's going to talk about the economic landscape of Kahnawà, past, present, and future. A very practical question for those of us looking at governance and moving forward and thinking about governance in Kahnawà. So looking at issues of dependency and ways that we've tried to address that in the community. And then we have someone who's actually part of our group here. I don't know if she's still on, but Charlotte Logan is going to be presenting as well about her research and other research in using linguistic evidence to tell a story about the ancestral presence of Kahnawà here in the Tiohtià:ke region. So we're very much looking forward to both of these. And just to let you know, we got 2 more, and we might have 1 more coming up as well. And if I do get that, I'll let you know for sure.
Yeah, now go as I would go on a 31 hodo, no siwa sundate, dogatena saying what Nigora is again is at the but yes, I would the cedar did not rest on your nest and go at this to get the knife to Nigora. Thank you, everybody.
yeah, I thank you.